Okay, welcome everybody. Just by way of introduction, I'm Dan Ortman, the Global Director of FinOps at SoftwareOne, and also fortunate enough to be on the governing board of the FinOps Foundation.
And I'm Parker Nancollas. I'm a senior FinOps consultant at SoftwareOne. And prior to becoming a consultant, I was a practitioner. So I actually set up the FinOps practice at my last organization.
So when we thought we'd have an opportunity to present this week, we were thinking, what's the most exciting topic that we could possibly come up with? So obviously, our speech is on SQL optimization today. So at SoftwareOne, if you're not familiar with us, we have a long history of licensing and contract optimization and expertise. So it is kind of a natural extension to the experience that we have. We've done a lot of work around this even before cloud, just optimizing SQL cost on premise. So we're going to bring some of that into today's presentation as well. So the agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about usage optimization and rate optimization, but let's just kind of jump right into it, Parker, because I know you're going to dive into that a little bit more. One of the statistics that I thought was interesting, though, is almost $2 million. That was the average expenditure of enterprises for what they're spending on SQL annually. And I think some of you in here, that it's probably tens of millions. It's not uncommon for us to see that. So when you think of low-hanging fruit, it might be reservations, savings plans, it might be hybrid benefits, but optimizing SQL and SQL licensing, it's such a big cost that if you can manage to optimize it, if you can work with DBAs and kind of go end to end of what we're going to go through today, there's a tremendous amount of value that you can get out of going through the process.
So in FinOps in general, everyone in here probably is familiar with the FinOps framework, and we talk about usage optimization and rate optimization, and there's different activities that you do in both of those. So with SQL optimization, it's the same thing. There are usage optimization activities that we can do, which we like to talk about those as having a technical impact. And then there is rate optimization that is the commercial side. And so unfortunately, in 25 minutes, we don't have time to go deep into each of these things, but the goal is to walk through many of these and give some stories and examples and highlight what the opportunities are for savings in some of these different areas. And so we're going to start off with looking at the usage optimization side of things.
All right, so decommissions. This one seems obvious, and what we want to start with is that how you stack all of these different strategies is really important. And before we talk about hybrid benefits or license optimization or any of those things that Parker was just talking about, what if you can just shut it off? Well, that seems like a no-brainer. It's kind of FinOps 101. But when you shut off a SQL server, which sometimes it's hard to get people to sign off on that because it's some legacy application where we're saying, oh, we still need that data, we've got to keep it on. Well, what is that costing, especially from a licensing standpoint? And it's massive. So when you can decommission a SQL server, that means a lot more than just decommissioning any server. So decommissions, it's an important point. Then performance analysis. So if you can't decommission it, then what can you look at in terms of performance? And so just like with, if you can decommission it, you can drop 100%. If you can't drop 100%, then let's look at an example of what you can do.
So this was an actual customer example from an environment that we worked on. And this is an oversimplified example, but for the sake of simplicity, they had 10 SQL servers that were all installed on F16S VMs in Azure. And the utilization of those was about 15%. And so you can see on the screen the cost of that. And the interesting thing to see is while the total cost was $640,000, the SQL licensing portion of that was over $500,000, a major portion of that total cost. And so what we helped with this organization through was to get the optimization on those licenses. So step one was, if you're only 15% utilized on F16Ss, we can right-size those down to F4Ss. Now instead of paying for 160 cores worth of licensing, you're only paying for 40 cores worth of licensing. And so the savings from that change alone was almost $500,000, but almost $400,000 of it was just the SQL licensing alone. And the other $86,000 you see on the screen includes, we're talking specifically about SQL here, but this conversation really expands into even more than that. There was a customer whose environment we were looking at recently who has all of they're using hybrid use benefits on all of their VMs with Windows installed, and that alone it drops the cost that they're paying to Azure for those VMs by about 45% for that specific customer. And so there's a lot of savings to be had even outside of SQL.
And then another interesting one is database consolidation. So you can actually, I don't know if there's any DBAs in here, but when you're installing, okay, we've got a couple. So when you're installing SQL Server, one of the things that's interesting is you can run multiple instances on the same server. So essentially, if you're not familiar with that, when you're installing SQL Server and going through the wizard and clicking the buttons, you can do that over and over and over again and give it different instance names. In some cases, you don't want to do that. It's not a technically viable option. But in some cases, instead of having different servers where you're paying for compute, you're paying for SQL licensing, you can put all of those different SQL instances on single servers, and you can massively reduce the cost if that's a technically viable option. So if we continue the example that Parker was just going through, if we take those F4s that we just transitioned and right-sized and turn those into maybe 2 larger servers, then it can actually even further reduce costs if we put all of those instances on those 2 servers. So it's another $26K in savings in SQL licensing. So again, it's how do you stack what's technically viable and what's the right order to do that in.
All right, so walking through just a few quick more examples on usage optimization. Does anybody know what the price difference is between SQL Server Enterprise and Standard? 4 times? Yeah, so that's about right. It's in a percentage, it's about 73% less for a standard license as for an enterprise license. And what we found from our customers on average is that customers, on average, need only about 25% of their SQL servers to be on enterprise licenses. What we normally see that the starting point is that they have about 50% of their licenses on enterprise. So when you consider the 73% price decrease just by making that shift, you can see how much that potential savings could be depending on what your current SQL Server spend is. So another option is application modernization. Now this is talking about things like moving from having SQL Server installed on a VM or EC2 to moving to something like Azure SQL DB, AWS RDP, things like that. But there's even a bigger conversation that's bigger than application modernization, which is just changing what you're using to something that gives you the performance you need but costs less. So other examples might be using a memory-optimized EC2 instance in AWS where you get the performance you need, but because it has fewer cores, the licensing cost is less. Sorry, I don't know why that went back, but there we go.
All right, so just for a minute here, let's take this a little bit back on premise too, because everybody isn't completely migrated to the cloud. And this pulls me way back to when I was really focused on SQL licensing days. So this might look familiar to some of you. So if you have a VMware environment and you want to license your physical hosts for unlimited virtualization, that may sound familiar to some of you. It may be completely foreign. The idea is if you have, let's say there's 20 physical hosts in a VMware environment, and if you put SQL on just 3 of them, all of your SQL servers on 3 of them, and license the physical hosts instead of the virtual machines, there's unlimited virtualization if you use SQL Server Enterprise. And so that was a common way that enterprises were licensing SQL, because then you didn't have to count. You just throw them on those hosts and you're good to go. The problem with that is now when we bring cloud into the picture and you want to migrate one of those servers because you're going to migrate that one application, now all of a sudden you take that one server off of host 3 in this example and the license can't come with it because you're licensing the physical host. You're licensing host number 3. So this was one of the challenges a few years ago we started to see as people started migrating to the cloud and their licenses were tied to a physical host. This became a really big challenge. So what your license strategy is and how you're managing those licenses as you are able to eliminate some of those hosts, and then how you invest in additional licensing rather than pay as you go, that's a whole strategy in and of itself. So this is one of the things that we found is just a really super interesting scenario on how you're going from on-premise to the cloud and how the licenses come with you or don't come with you.
Okay, so that's kind of again, kind of a high level on the things that we can do for usage optimization. One of the really important things with usage optimization, like we know even bigger than SQL with all of FinOps when we talk usage optimization, is how important the collaboration is. It takes working with people from multiple different teams to be able to actually enact those optimization opportunities. So now that we've talked about that, we're going to move into some rate optimization activities, which again, and especially with SQL, still requires collaboration with a cross-functional team, as well as making sure that we do these things, like Dan mentioned, in a specific order that makes the most sense based on what we're optimizing.
Yeah, so the one example is software assurance. So this is specifically a Microsoft scenario. So if you're in Azure, a lot of you are probably already familiar with hybrid benefits. So you have hybrid benefits with your software assurance, but it's not just hybrid benefits that you get with software assurance. And this used to be a really big conversation on-premise because it was even how can you move servers from one physical host to another physical host, and the license mobility, and we could spend 25 minutes just on any one of those topics. But the software assurance utilization, when it comes to the cloud, if you're in Azure and hybrid benefits aren't being used, it's a huge missed opportunity. Contract strategy, this is another interesting one. So depending on what contract you're leveraging with any of the cloud providers, but especially with Microsoft, if you have an enterprise agreement, or if you're using an SCE or a server cloud enrollment, if you're not familiar with that, a server cloud enrollment is just saying, I'm going to have software assurance on every SQL Server license that I have. And if you do that, because you're going to use hybrid benefits anyway, there's a deeper discount just on buying the licenses. It's a big discount on buying licenses, and there's even the only way you get a discount on software assurance. So what contract you're on, even whether no matter how you're deploying it or what the technical strategy is, just what contract you're using to purchase the licensing changes what the price is. And of course that means, in the FinOps world, the value you're getting out of that workload. And then finally, the license strategy. So, how you're leveraging those licenses, this is what kind of ties it all together. So are you using the hybrid benefits? Are you using it as you modernize? How are you communicating that? So it's not as easy when you're just going from, lift and shift, where it's just this server with this many cores goes to this server with that many cores. There's a transition going into managed instances or Azure SQL DB, but you can still use your licenses and hybrid benefits even whenever you're modernizing the applications. So how you're using that licensing strategy, and even buying more licenses instead of pay as you go. There's a really good case that you can make as a FinOps practitioner on buying more licenses instead of buying less, because over time, it's incredibly valuable. So the license strategy can be a big deal. And just to illustrate that, so we've got a couple things just to walk through examples here. So this again is going back to the example of enterprise versus standard. So you can see there's a very big difference. And what we're showing here between the three bars are pay-as-you-go versus enterprise agreement versus server and cloud enrollment. So what you might think is, okay, so the enterprise agreement might actually be more expensive. But what you have to look at is over time. And this is where whether you have the licenses already today and you're only paying for the software assurance, or even if you're buying new licenses, looking at a 6-year ROI becomes really important. Because now you see, after that 3 years, when you own the license and then you're just paying for the software assurance, all of a sudden the cost skyrockets for pay-as-you-go and is way less for owning the license. So knowing how you're purchasing, what the long-term strategy looks like is really important, and what contract it's on has a big impact.
All right, so now we just kind of want to tie this back into FinOps as a whole and the FinOps principles. And one of the key principles is, well, I mean, they're all key. One of the FinOps principles is teams need to collaborate. It's a key principle when we're talking about optimization and SQL optimization. And the reason is how many people are involved in that process. So you have, for example, an engineer who's the one who's actually creating these resources, using the resources that need the SQL licenses. Then you have the procurement team, who is the one who's working with Microsoft or in the case of other licenses, whatever the vendor is to actually procure those licenses. And then you have the ITAM team, who is the team who, if you have an ITAM team, should understand what the current license position is, and if and where there are opportunities to reharvest licensing. And then you've got the FinOps practitioner, who, hopefully you've got the FinOps practitioner involved in that, making sure everyone's working together, collaborating together, communicating with each other, so that we can all work together to make the best decisions. And so we're going to walk through an example just to highlight the importance of that collaboration, and we're going to bring it back to that first example that we walked through with the environment we worked on, where they had 10 F16S SQL servers with only 15% utilization. Although this time, the first time we walked through the example, we were using the pay-as-you-go numbers, which are higher, and most organizations probably have some agreement in place. With this one, we're actually going to use the best case scenario numbers, which is that they're on an SCE, that type of contract, and that all of their licenses are more than 3 years old, so they're only paying for the software assurance. So it's probably more relatable this way. The savings numbers are less than they'd be if our example was using the other numbers, and so you can still see how big of a difference this can make. So if you have a good, well-working FinOps practice with cross-functional collaboration, then when the FinOps practitioner realizes that there's an opportunity, a potential opportunity there for optimization, the FinOps practitioner reaches out to the engineer and works with the engineer to get those consolidated and right-sized, so that we're down from paying for 160 cores worth of SQL licensing to 32. Now that's a $195,000 savings to that engineer. We still own those licenses, so it doesn't really make a difference to the organization. We'll get to that. But to the engineer, assuming you're doing chargeback, they now are saving $195,000. Again, if we've got that collaboration, now the ITAM team is aware of those licenses that were just freed up and knows that those can be used for future workloads. So when a second engineer comes through FinOps or to the ITAM team and says, hey, we need exactly 128 cores for this thing that we're building, instead of the engineer going to procurement, where they would be paying $408,000 to get new licenses on their SCE agreement to cover that workload, now they go through FinOps and ITAM and know that they can use those 128 unused cores worth of licensing, and the software assurance cost on those that got freed up for the first engineer is $195,000, so that's what gets billed to the engineer. So that engineer just avoided $213,000 of cost to her workload, but the organization as a whole just saved $400,000 because they didn't go buy 64 new 2-core license packs. And so this really just highlights how important it is to have that collaboration. There's a lot of people involved here, and if they're not talking, they might be making decisions that make sense to them, but maybe aren't the right decision as a whole to the organization, especially when maybe individual engineers are only seeing their portion of costs and not considering the impact to the whole organization. But when you do it right, and even using the numbers that are best case scenario numbers, you can see how big that impact can be when we are collaborating the way we should.
So back to what Parker said at the beginning, there's only so much you can dive into with SQL optimization in 25 minutes. But hopefully you got some little golden nugget, as Eric Mull would say in back of the room here. Hopefully you got a golden nugget out of that. But if there's any questions, we would love to answer some questions now, except for the people in the front here.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Parker. That was really great. Really loved how you use licenses as a construct for rate optimization. We're going to try something new. This is a green foam mic. I've safety checked it. I've thrown it at 5 of my colleagues. Only 1 got hurt, so 4 to 5 of you will be fine.
Hey, it worked. Quick question on, is there a magic bullet if I pointed this at my Azure tenant? Multiple billing accounts, lots of different things, we'll just say things, right? 25,000 resources. Is there a magic bullet that will tell me all of the SQL that I have in there? Whether it's in a DB, whether it's an instance, whether it's like a full VM running SQL.
You want to take it?
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
Well,
Is there a magic bullet?
I was going to say, because I think my answer would be no, but I'll let him explain.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably a lot of answers with FinOps is that there is no magic bullet. I think that's why the average number of tools FinOps practitioners are using is 4, because a lot of times it takes multiple tools. What I would say, though, is a really good SAM practice is because there's a license impact to any of those, even managed instances, even Azure SQL DB, there's a license impact because you can use hybrid benefits. So with an ITAM practice that's more advanced, that should be continuously maintained and where the licenses are applied. So while I would say there's not a magic bullet, I would say if that is sitting with ITAM, that's going to be the best place to see where all of that's sitting at once, because that all has a licensing impact.
Yeah, just just to add to that a little bit, right as I said no, but let him answer, then I thought of all kinds of stuff I want to say. But yeah, that's kind of the magic bullet is to have a well-working ITAM team, but that's not a magic bullet as far as I can't just make that happen from one day to the next. And it's not uncommon for us to have customers who ask that question, like we don't even know how many licenses we're using, and how do we figure that out? It is hard, and it's like FinOps, where it takes time. And so there's tooling that can help with that, but just like there's FinOps tooling that can support a FinOps team, tooling around licensing and ITAM needs an ITAM team supporting it, an ITAM practice, whatever that might look like. And so that's the magic bullet, but it's not an easy one.
Are there any surefire cases where you would recommend open source SQL versus continuing with vendor lock-in? A lot was about licensing that can just be dispensed with if they build on MySQL Postgres.
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one, because in some cases that's a great opportunity to lower cost. In some cases, you might have a vendor that has certain requirements. And so not only will they say it has to be SQL, but they may say it has to be SQL running on 8 cores. And so even if your utilization is low, you might lose support if you reduce it from 8 cores. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a technical discussion. I mean, it totally depends on what application you're running it for, but that's a great opportunity to completely lower costs, right? I mean, you're taking completely the licensing out of the picture then, yeah.
So I've got a little bit of breaking news here. So I'm on an ITAM team in a company, and one of our barriers to using Azure Hybrid Benefit was the difficulty of knowing what our license position was, particularly in the cloud. On-prem, we didn't really have an issue, but in the cloud, we did. And so we were talking to Microsoft, and in the first stages, it was not real impressive, because it's like, oh yeah, just run this report for each subscription. And we were basically asking our MSP to run 24 different reports every month to determine our license position. I said, that's not good enough. So just within the last few weeks, we've had more conversations. Basically, we can turn on an agent, and they now Microsoft has a cloud-native dashboard that actually looks pretty good. So if you guys are having issues with that, I'd recommend you reach out to Microsoft and at least look at that as a possibility before you look at other independent tooling.
Yeah.
Then I also have 2 questions of my own. So first one is for on-prem, and in my company, we tend to buy things like Nutanix nodes, and we do load sharing. And so that means that it isn't necessarily the case for SQL, but in many cases, if you're using any SQL enterprise at all, you pretty much have to license the entire node for enterprise, which means the opportunities for standard versus enterprise are now at best muddied or at worst eliminated. Thoughts?
Yeah, agreed. So the scenario where you're licensing a physical host, you're right. The best way to license is going to be SQL Enterprise for unlimited virtualization, and then standard and enterprise come out of the picture. But as you look to migrate one application at a time to the cloud, now all of a sudden, if because we had the ability to deploy enterprise even though we didn't need it, now you have to reevaluate every single one of those workloads to see, what are we doing? Is it because we have 3 availability replicas and so we have to have enterprise? Or what is the reason that we're running enterprise? And if there is no reason, now you have to install it with SQL Standard when you're moving it, if you're paying for those net new licenses, or if you're paying pay as you go, because it'll have a big impact on the price. So you're right that there's not a benefit, but when you start migrating, you've lost all that opportunity if everything was deployed as enterprise.
So the other question is, as you look at Azure Hybrid Benefit, the no-brainer one is on Windows Server Data Center, because you can literally duplicate your on-prem licensing and your Azure cloud. So you use the same license in both areas, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
However, for SQL, it's more complicated, and you might actually have to buy new licenses if you want to do that. We looked at that, and to my surprise, for a initial license buy, and we get a pretty good discount because we do have an enterprise agreement, it was actually more. It didn't justify using the Azure Hybrid Benefit.
Yeah.
Have you run into that, like in situations where if it were an existing license that you were able to free up internally, you could then use it because it would be low cost SA, but if you had to buy the new license, it wasn't cost effective. Is that a pattern that you're seeing?
Yeah, completely have seen that, especially if you're doing a 3-year ROI. If you do a 6-year ROI, that's where it starts to change. But definitely have seen the same thing, yeah.
We have a question over here. You don't have a question? Okay. Is anyone else a question over here?
Using MS SQL on Amazon RDS, is there any opportunity for rate optimization if you're renting the licenses, or any strategy as into would it be more cost efficient to try and actually run that on an EC2 instance and buy a license for it versus just renting and using the managed service?
Did you want to go?
I think I understood the question. Yeah, yes, there's opportunities. I feel like the conversation's easier around Azure. There's more opportunities. One thing I mentioned was memory optimized instances. There's little things like that you can do, just making sure that you are. I'd say the biggest opportunity in AWS is going to be around right-sizing the actual instance it's running on so that you're not paying for more SQL than you have to, or looking into alternate solutions. And I mean, that's going to totally depend whether or what specific option does make sense. But yeah, looking at like database as a service, things like that might be better or might not be. The other thing to consider is how, I mean, most of these workloads are likely running all the time, but if you don't need to run something all the time, things like, and this applies to Microsoft as well, but if something's running 10% of the time, then it probably makes more sense to just do pay as you go and not cover that with an existing license, unless you have licenses to spare. So I guess that would be another thing just to look at is what the utilization is as far as hours on those instances. But those are my thoughts. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay.
Maybe one more question. Yeah, we have time for one more, and I'll bring it over here.
So I would like to follow up on the parallel use. For Windows Server, Azure Hybrid Benefits allows parallel use, like on-prem and on the cloud. For SQL licenses, is this not possible at all? Not even for a grace period, like 180 days? Is it depending on the license type, like enterprise or the standard?
Yeah, so good question. So, so Windows Server, as you were just talking about this, Windows Server, there's actually two scenarios. Windows Server Standard, if you're going to use that license that you've applied to a server in the cloud and use hybrid benefits, you have to move it. But you take it off of on-prem and you move it into the cloud. If it's Windows Server Data Center, then you actually get dual use rights. So you can still use the license on-prem, but you can also use it in the cloud. SQL, there is no option like that. You have to do one or the other. Yeah.
All right, Parker, Dan, thanks so much. Everyone, round of applause. Great information, and you can catch
Thank
up
you.
with them at their booth. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching that session. I'm sitting here in San Diego right after FinOps X. We hope you join us next year here live 2024. In the meantime, please subscribe to the channel and join the community. Get involved, join the summits, get in a working group, and don't forget to get FinOps certified. Because next year here in San Diego for FinOps X, it's going to be twice as big. Come join the party. Come meet your people. Welcome home.